The night began in a way that seemed perfectly ordinary, the kind of evening you almost wish you could fold up and tuck away in your pocket to pull out later, as a reminder of peace. Early fall in the quiet suburbs outside Atlanta carried that kind of stillness. Air crisp enough to invite open windows, streets wide and spaced out with the sleepy hush that falls when the workday has long ended. I was a few cars back at a red light, watching the glow of taillights ripple along the line when I noticed the black SUV just ahead of me. The silhouettes inside caught my attention immediately, almost like watching a small stage play unfold behind glass. A tall man sat at the wheel, posture relaxed. A woman leaned halfway around in her seat to check the back, and two children bounced and wriggled with a last burst of leftover birthday energy. A loose ribbon from a balloon floated gently in the back window, the remnant of a party still lingering in the air, and when the breeze cut across the open crack in my window, I swear I caught the faint trace of frosting drifting out, sugary and sweet. The light turned green, traffic rolled forward, and the voices from the SUV rose with it. The children sang in clumsy unison, off-key, loud enough to draw a smile to my face even though the words were mangled and broken. In that moment, it looked like any other family wrapping up a celebration, driving home with tired bodies but full hearts. Later, I would learn that the man behind the wheel was Governor Derek Lawson. In that moment, though, he didn't look like a politician, didn't look like a leader carrying the weight of a state. He looked like every father who has just watched his kids laugh over too much cake. His shoulders dropped in relaxation, his grip on the wheel light, his smile wide and unhidden. He reached over and tapped his wife Monica's fingers where they rested on the center console, a small gesture of affection that told me the day had been long but good. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that signals exhaustion and contentment both, and in the back seat, the children carried on with their silly chorus, inventing words when they forgot the real ones, hammering the rhythm with the slap of palms against knees. From my car, I could almost hear the man exhale, a sigh that let out not only the day but the pressure of his public role. For just a few minutes, Derek Lawson wasn't the governor. He was only a dad. Nothing more and nothing less, and the whole SUV seemed to radiate the warm relief of that truth. We slowed for a turn, and the SUV's windows lined up with mine. For the first time, I caught a clear glimpse of the driver's face in the soft glow of the dashboard. His profile struck me. The square jaw, the threads of gray brushing his temples, the kind of face you might recognize from a podium or a newspaper photo but never expect to see at an ordinary four-way stop. His lips moved as he spoke, and through the crack of my own window I caught the faint sound of his words, quiet but careful. Just tonight, I'm only a dad. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a slogan. It was a whispered prayer, an earnest wish. Monica reached across to squeeze his arm, her expression tender, and in the back, their daughter clutched a gift bag like it was treasure, while their son blew across the neck of a deflated balloon to make his sister squeal. That moment was so perfect it almost seemed fragile, a snapshot of ordinary joy that could shatter if touched. The road stretched on with rows of small ranch houses, porch lights glowing, baseball nets leaning against driveways. Everything about the scene spoke of calm, until a patrol car slid quietly onto the street behind us. It wasn't dramatic. No siren, no shouted order. Just the steady glow of red and blue lights spilling across the back of the SUV like a tide washing over paint. I saw Lawson's posture change almost imperceptibly. Not fear exactly, but tension that registered even from my vantage point a car behind. His eyes flicked to the mirror, then back to the lanes ahead. He drew in a longer breath this time, the kind you hold before making a decision. The patrol car didn't pass. Instead, it shadowed the SUV, matching each turn deliberately, hanging back far enough to feign coincidence but close enough to make the intent clear. Monica's hand slipped from the console to rest on Derek's shoulder, her body angled slightly toward him. I could read her lips forming the words, "Did we do something wrong?" The tone was soft at first, then louder, more insistent as the SUV continued forward under the glow of red and blue. Derek turned a small smile in her direction, not the kind meant for humor but for reassurance, the kind of smile you give to calm children first, and yourself second. His hand shifted back to the wheel in the classic 10 and 2. The children's humming continued, blissfully unaware that the temperature inside the vehicle had just dropped several degrees. We passed through a small commercial strip, the kind with a dry cleaner, a taco joint, a pharmacy already dark for the night. The patrol car edged closer now, narrowing the space between bumpers until it seemed you could measure it by heartbeats. I saw Lawson blink slower, his body adjusting, choosing a lane with more shoulder. A calculation only visible if you were watching closely. Monica's fingers gripped tighter. Their son caught sight of the patrol car in the mirror, his small brow furrowing. The daughter, without being told, grew quiet. Then the road widened into a broader boulevard divided by a row of sycamores, and that's when the quiet shattered. The siren didn't ease in. It tore through the night in a sharp wail that lifted every head on the block, bouncing off parked cars and shopfront windows until it sounded like the entire world was alarmed. The red and blue lights no longer glowed. They hammered, strobing across the SUV's body with urgent rhythm. In the back seat, the children's singing stopped instantly. I heard the girl's tiny voice drift into the air. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" The question hung fragile as glass. Lawson signaled before slowing, though the road around us was empty of traffic. He guided the SUV to the curb with care, treating the vehicle like something fragile, as though the act of pulling over could itself teach his children control. He didn't brake hard or swerve. He did everything measured, as if performing for an unseen jury. When the car stopped, it idled softly, the sound barely audible against the siren. From my position, I saw his hands lift deliberately off the wheel, hovering where they could be easily seen. He turned once to look back at his son, then his daughter, nodding with a steady expression that carried no drama but conveyed calm. Monica leaned forward, her chin resting in her hand, eyes locked on the mirror to measure the distance of the patrol car. My pulse thudded against the steering wheel as I waited, watching the patrol car draw up tight, angling the SUV against the curb. The red and blue lights painted the interior of the vehicle in hues that looked unnatural on human skin. For a long beat, nothing moved. No door opened. No radio crackled. Just the panting siren throttled down until it sounded mechanical, and somewhere far off a dog barked as if responding to the alarm. Inside the SUV, I could see Lawson's shoulders rise and fall with a long exhale. His face not brave exactly. Not resigned either, but prepared, the way only someone who has been through this before can be. He clicked the hazard lights on, and the tiny amber triangles blinked steadily, polite little warnings in a scene that was anything but polite. The gesture struck me. It tried and failed to make the situation ordinary, and the failure of that attempt made it more tragic. He shifted the gear into park and reached across to squeeze Monica's hand, his eyes telling her what words could not. She didn't reply with words either. Her silence was taut, heavy, a rope pulled tight in the darkness. From where I sat, I wiped a circle clear on my fogging windshield just as the patrol car's door creaked open. A boot hit the pavement with deliberate force, and the night, which had seemed kind all evening, suddenly turned cold and sharp. Lawson didn't glance back at his children again. He squared his jaw, settled himself in the seat, and waited, hands still visible, voice unraised, determined to remain calm no matter what came next. The warm family evening had folded shut in an instant, replaced by the opening page of something harsh and unforgiving, a story that would be written in the next few minutes under flashing lights and unblinking cameras. The night began in a way that seemed perfectly ordinary, the kind of evening you almost wish you could fold up and tuck away in your pocket to pull out later as a reminder of peace. Early fall in the quiet suburbs outside Atlanta carried that kind of stillness, air crisp enough to invite open windows, streets wide and spaced out with the sleepy hush that falls when the workday has long ended. I was a few cars back at a red light, watching the glow of taillights ripple along the line when I noticed the black SUV just ahead of me. The silhouettes inside caught my attention immediately, almost like watching a small stage play unfold behind glass. A tall man sat at the wheel, posture relaxed. A woman leaned halfway around in her seat to check the back, and two children bounced and wriggled with a last burst of leftover birthday energy. A loose ribbon from a balloon floated gently in the back window, the remnant of a party still lingering in the air, and when the breeze cut across the open crack in my window, I swear I caught the faint trace of frosting drifting out, sugary and sweet. The light turned green, traffic rolled forward, and the voices from the SUV rose with it. The children sang in clumsy unison, off-key, loud enough to draw a smile to my face even though the words were mangled and broken. In that moment, it looked like any other family wrapping up a celebration, driving home with tired bodies but full hearts. Later, I would learn that the man behind the wheel was Governor Derek Lawson. In that moment, though, he didn't look like a politician, didn't look like a leader carrying the weight of a state. He looked like every father who has just watched his kids laugh over too much cake. His shoulders dropped in relaxation, his grip on the wheel light, his smile wide and unhidden. He reached over and tapped his wife Monica's fingers where they rested on the center console, a small gesture of affection that told me the day had been long, but good. She laughed softly, the kind of laugh that signals exhaustion and contentment both, and in the back seat, the children carried on with their silly chorus, inventing words when they forgot the real ones, hammering the rhythm with the slap of palms against knees. From my car, I could almost hear the man exhale, a sigh that let out not only the day but the pressure of his public role. For just a few minutes, Derek Lawson wasn't the governor. He was only a dad, nothing more and nothing less, and the whole SUV seemed to radiate the warm relief of that truth. We slowed for a turn, and the SUV's windows lined up with mine. For the first time, I caught a clear glimpse of the driver's face in the soft glow of the dashboard. His profile struck me, the square jaw, the threads of gray brushing his temples, the kind of face you might recognize from a podium or a newspaper photo but never expect to see at an ordinary four-way stop. His lips moved as he spoke, and through the crack of my own window I caught the faint sound of his words, quiet but careful. Just tonight, I'm only a dad. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a slogan. It was a whispered prayer, an earnest wish. Monica reached across to squeeze his arm, her expression tender, and in the back, their daughter clutched a gift bag like it was treasure, while their son blew across the neck of a deflated balloon to make his sister squeal. That moment was so perfect it almost seemed fragile. A snapshot of ordinary joy that could shatter if touched. The road stretched on with rows of small ranch houses, porch lights glowing, baseball nets leaning against driveways. Everything about the scene spoke of calm, until a patrol car slid quietly onto the street behind us. It wasn't dramatic. No siren, no shouted order, just the steady glow of red and blue lights spilling across the back of the SUV like a tide washing over paint. I saw Lawson's posture change almost imperceptibly. Not fear exactly, but tension that registered even from my vantage point a car behind. His eyes flicked to the mirror, then back to the lanes ahead. He drew in a longer breath this time, the kind you hold before making a decision. The patrol car didn't pass. Instead, it shadowed the SUV, matching each turn deliberately, hanging back far enough to feign coincidence but close enough to make the intent clear. Monica's hand slipped from the console to rest on Derek's shoulder, her body angled slightly toward him. I could read her lips forming the words, "Did we do something wrong?" The tone was soft at first, then louder, more insistent, as the SUV continued forward under the glow of red and blue. Derek turned a small smile in her direction, not the kind meant for humor but for reassurance, the kind of smile you give to calm children first and yourself second. His hands shifted back to the wheel in the classic 10 and 2. The children's humming continued, blissfully unaware that the temperature inside the vehicle had just dropped several degrees. We passed through a small commercial strip, the kind with a dry cleaner, a taco joint, a pharmacy already dark for the night. The patrol car edged closer now, narrowing the space between bumpers until it seemed you could measure it by heartbeats. I saw Lawson blink slower, his body adjusting, choosing a lane with more shoulder, a calculation only visible if you were watching closely. Monica's fingers gripped tighter. Their son caught sight of the patrol car in the mirror, his small brow furrowing. The daughter, without being told, grew quiet. Then the road widened into a broader boulevard divided by a row of sycamores, and that's when the quiet shattered. The siren didn't ease in. It tore through the night in a sharp wail that lifted every head on the block, bouncing off parked cars and shopfront windows until it sounded like the entire world was alarmed. The red and blue lights no longer glowed. They hammered, strobing across the SUV's body with urgent rhythm. In the back seat, the children's singing stopped instantly. I heard the girl's tiny voice drift into the air. "Daddy, are we in trouble?" The question hung fragile as glass. Lawson signaled before slowing, though the road around us was empty of traffic. He guided the SUV to the curb with care, treating the vehicle like something fragile, as though the act of pulling over could itself teach his children control. He didn't brake hard or swerve. He did everything measured, as if performing for an unseen jury. When the car stopped, it idled softly, the sound barely audible against the siren. From my position, I saw his hands lift deliberately off the wheel, hovering where they could be easily seen. He turned once to look back at his son, then his daughter, nodding with a steady expression that carried no drama but conveyed calm. Monica leaned forward, her chin resting in her hand, eyes locked on the mirror to measure the distance of the patrol car. My pulse thudded against the steering wheel as I waited, watching the patrol car draw up tight, angling the SUV against the curb. The red and blue lights painted the interior of the vehicle in hues that looked unnatural on human skin. For a long beat, nothing moved. No door opened. No radio crackled. Just the panting siren throttled down until it sounded mechanical, and somewhere far off a dog barked as if responding to the alarm. Inside the SUV, I could see Lawson's shoulders rise and fall with a long exhale. His face not brave exactly, not resigned either, but prepared, the way only someone who has been through this before can be. He clicked the hazard lights on, and the tiny amber triangles blinked steadily, polite little warnings in a scene that was anything but polite. The gesture struck me. It tried and failed to make the situation ordinary, and the failure of that attempt made it more tragic. He shifted the gear into park and reached across to squeeze Monica's hand, his eyes telling her what words could not. She didn't reply with words either. Her silence was taut, heavy, a rope pulled tight in the darkness. From where I sat, I wiped a circle clear on my fogging windshield just as the patrol car's door creaked open. A boot hit the pavement with deliberate force, and the night, which had seemed kind all evening, suddenly turned cold and sharp. Lawson didn't glance back at his children again. He squared his jaw, settled himself in the seat and waited, hands still visible, voice unraised, determined to remain calm, no matter what came next. The warm family evening had folded shut in an instant, replaced by the opening page of something harsh and unforgiving, a story that would be written in the next few minutes under flashing lights and unblinking cameras. The standoff on that quiet Atlanta street teetered on the edge of something explosive, and everyone watching seemed to know it. Derek Lawson stood with his hands high, his posture a strange blend of surrender and strength, a father doing everything he could to keep his children safe. The officer loomed over him, jaw tight, chest heaving in the flashing red and blue. Then, without warning, Rick Halpern made his move. He swung his fist, a heavy, blunt strike that landed squarely on Lawson's shoulder. The sound cracked through the night, flat and brutal, echoing against storefront glass. Derek staggered sideways, crashing into the hood of the SUV with a grunt, the metal groaning under the blow. Monica's scream pierced the air, raw and sharp, her body lunging forward until her seatbelt snapped her back. In the back seat, the boy broke into sobs, his small fists beating the empty air, while the girl's wail rose so high it seemed to splinter. "Stop!" someone shouted from the sidewalk. "He's not resisting." The voice came from a white-haired woman who stood tall despite her trembling hands. Her phone was raised high, recording every second. Her voice filled with a mother's fury. Halpern's head whipped toward her, eyes narrowing. "Stay back or you'll regret it," he growled, one hand brushing the butt of his holstered gun. The threat was like ice water poured over the crowd. A hush fell, sharp and cold, as every bystander seemed to hold their breath, torn between fear and witness. Then came the metallic snap of steel on steel. Halpern seized Lawson's arm and twisted it back in one brutal motion, wrenching the governor down toward the hood. The governor gritted his teeth, his body bent under the pressure as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. The sound of the ratcheting lock was louder than the siren, a cold punctuation mark on the humiliation. The phones lit up brighter, their tiny red dots blinking like fireflies in a storm. The hazard lights of the SUV blinked slow amber against the frantic red and blue wash, a rhythm that made the entire moment feel suspended in some cruel choreography. Derek Lawson, the elected leader of the state, was forced to his knees on a quiet suburban street, transformed in an instant from governor to suspect. His face remained composed, but the strain was clear in the tight set of his jaw. He looked through the open window at Monica, who clutched their children in desperation. And somehow he managed a small nod, nearly invisible but filled with reassurance. Even in chains, even under assault, his instinct was still to protect his family. Around us, the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath. Porch lights flicked on one by one as residents stepped onto stoops drawn by the noise, their phones held out to capture what was unfolding. The smell of hot metal and distant rain mixed in the air. Somewhere down the block, a car alarm chirped once and died, as if the night itself had flinched. What had begun as a quiet family drive had become a spectacle of power and prejudice. a scene no one there would ever forget. Monica's voice rose again above the siren, cracking with desperation. "Please, our children, please." She was half standing in her seat, one arm stretched toward her husband, the other shielding their daughter. Her words cut through the flashing chaos, landing on every ear, on every phone recording, embedding themselves into memory. The children sobbed so hard their small shoulders shook. "Daddy, Daddy!" they cried, their voices sharp with panic. The crowd shifted, edging closer but never crossing the invisible line drawn by fear. Parents in the crowd clutched their own children tighter. Strangers blinked back tears, and a shared ache hung heavy in the air. Then the hiss of tires on wet pavement announced a new arrival. Another patrol car slid into position behind the first, headlights sweeping the scene. Its door opened slowly and a tall woman stepped out. Later I would learn her name, Lieutenant Laura Briggs, a ranking officer in the precinct. She walked with a calm authority that cut through the tension, her back straight, her dark coat falling in perfect lines. The flashing lights revealed silver strands in her pulled-back hair, and her face was carved into a mask of control, unreadable, almost cold. For a fleeting second, the crowd hoped her presence might mean reason, that perhaps she would put an end to the cruelty. Someone whispered, "Finally." But when she approached Halpern, her boots clicking on the pavement, she leaned in close, just enough to share a breath with him, and spoke words too quiet for most to hear. "I was close enough to catch them. Make sure it's handled quickly." The line was soft, almost gentle, but it chilled me more than Halpern's shouting. She didn't question the cuffs biting into Lawson's wrists. She didn't challenge the force used against a man who had done nothing but comply. With that one sentence, she revealed that this was not the work of one rogue officer, but a machine closing ranks around its own. A ripple of disbelief ran through the crowd. Someone behind me muttered, "She's backing him up," in a voice caught between anger and awe. Halpern nodded sharply like a soldier receiving orders. His grip on Lawson's arm tightened, but Lawson straightened his spine, rising to meet the pressure with his own quiet force. The cameras kept rolling, their tiny red dots multiplying like watchful eyes. The street responded with a new sound, outrage. "Let him go," a man shouted from the crosswalk. "He's done nothing," a woman cried, her voice breaking but fierce. The chant began low, then swelled, voices bouncing off shopfront glass and car hoods. "Let him go! Let him go!" Phones lifted higher, live streams blooming across the internet in real time. I glimpsed one screen scrolling with comments. "This is happening now, share it." Halpern barked at the crowd, his voice cracking with desperation. "Back off or you'll regret it." His free hand hovered over his gun in a silent threat. The chant wavered but did not stop. Parents pulled children closer, but cameras stayed steady. A delivery driver down the block raised his phone and shouted, "We see you." His voice shook, but it carried, and the crowd answered with cheers. Through it all, Lawson did something that froze me where I stood. With his arms pinned and his wrists cuffed, he turned his head and met Halpern's glare, then looked directly at Briggs. His voice, though calm, carried heavier than any shout. "You are abusing your power," he said, each word measured and clear, "and everyone here can see it." The sentence rang like a bell. For a heartbeat, even the sirens seemed to pause. The crowd erupted in murmurs and whispers of agreement. Some shouted, "Yes." Others whispered the word under their breath, as if drawing courage from the simple truth. Briggs's mask cracked for the smallest second, a flicker of something unreadable flashing in her eyes before she quickly buried it again. Halpern's jaw clenched tight, his knuckles whitening as he tightened the cuffs another notch, as if pressure could erase words already spoken. But the truth was out, carved into the humid night air, and no amount of force could take it back. Porch lights blinked on farther down the block, a neighborhood awakening to bear witness. The chant rose again, stronger now, echoing with new determination. "Let him go! Let him go!" Notifications chimed from phones across the street, live streams multiplying, audiences growing. "Already 20,000 watching," a teenager muttered into his mic, eyes glued to the screen. Another woman called her sister on speakerphone, holding it in the air. "It's him," she said, voice shaking. "They've got the governor in cuffs right here." And still, Derek Lawson said nothing more. He used silence as his weapon, standing steady, his gaze unwavering, his shoulders squared against humiliation. He was a father first, a leader second, and he refused to let rage or fear define the lesson his children were watching. The crowd pressed closer, their voices louder, their phones higher, while the officers stood rigid under the blaze of lights. The fragile line between control and collapse stretched thin. The night had changed forever. What had begun as one officer's aggression had become a confrontation between power and truth, between a man in chains and a community unwilling to look away. And though the outcome was not yet written, it was clear to everyone standing on that street, holding cameras and holding breath, that history itself was beginning to turn. The night was already heavy with tension, the street pulsing with the red and blue wash of patrol lights, the crowd chanting, the cameras streaming. Derek Lawson stood cuffed, his arms forced behind his back, his body bent but not broken, his silence louder than any protest. Officer Rick Halpern's grip was merciless, his jaw clenched as if the very act of restraint could erase what had already been witnessed. Lieutenant Briggs stood nearby, her face carved into the stone mask of authority, her words of quiet support still hanging in the air like smoke. And then, in the middle of this cruel tableau, something happened that shifted everything. Halpern yanked Derek forward, pulling him hard by the shoulder and cuffs. A violent tug meant to bend him over the SUV's hood. The force twisted Lawson's jacket off-center, pulling the lapel askew. Fabric strained, caught for a moment, then gave way. In that small, violent motion, an object slipped loose, tumbling downward. It clinked once against the hood, skittered along the curve of the fender and landed by the front tire, catching the light as it settled. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the crowd's phones, dozens of them, caught the gleam at once. The object lit up under the glow of LEDs like a tiny sun, brighter than its size should have allowed. It was a gold pin, no bigger than a coin, etched with the official crest of the state. A wreath encircling a shield, the symbol stamped on seals, podiums, and press conferences. The kind of emblem that is not purchased, not ornamental, but bestowed. The kind of emblem that means authority, legitimacy, office. Recognition spread through the crowd like a spark racing across dry grass. A teenager with a bike leaned forward, his phone zooming tight on the small piece of metal. His voice cracked with awe as he whispered, "Hold up. Look at that." He hesitated, then shouted louder, the words exploding from his throat like a revelation. "That's Governor Lawson." His cry ripped through the air, bounced off storefronts, and came back amplified. The street erupted. "Governor!" someone echoed from a porch. "Governor Lawson!" Another voice answered from the corner. The chant that had been a demand moments ago now transformed into a proclamation. Heads turned, phones tilted, and suddenly the red and blue glare seemed smaller than the weight of that single title. Halpern froze. For the first time all night, his confidence cracked. His grip on Lawson didn't loosen, but his eyes flicked downward toward the pin, then upward toward the governor's face, then out toward the ring of cameras now circling him, like predators scenting weakness. His bark of authority faltered, and what came out instead was panic disguised as volume. "Don't believe that," he shouted, his voice breaking on the last word. "He's a fraud." But denial sounded nothing like certainty, and every trembling line of his face betrayed him. His pupils were blown wide, his jaw clenched and unclenched as though he could grind the truth into dust, but the evidence glittered on the pavement, undeniable. Lieutenant Briggs, who had until now held herself with the rigid control of someone calculating optics, turned her gaze to the pin. For the first time her mask slipped. Her face went pale in the strobe light, her eyes darting from the emblem to the sea of phones to Halpern's unraveling posture. A small step backward betrayed her, not retreat so much as recalculation. She smoothed the sleeve of her coat, a meaningless gesture as though tidying her appearance could erase the disaster unfolding before her. She didn't speak, but her silence was louder than any command. The crowd surged, voices colliding, overlapping, transforming shock into anger and awe. "Governor!" They shouted again and again until the word became a rhythm, a drumbeat. Porch lights along the block flared on like witnesses roused from slumber. A woman in a housecoat stepped onto her stoop, holding her phone high with both hands, lips parted in disbelief. Teenagers ducked closer, their live streams framing the pin, their comment feeds flooding with words. "Is that real? Oh my God, that's the seal. I voted for him. This is happening live." The hashtag formed itself in real time, climbing across screens faster than any siren could travel. Monica, still twisted in her seat, saw the pin on the ground, saw the crowd chanting, saw the sudden shift in power, and her expression changed. Her tears slowed, replaced by a steady fierceness. She pressed her palm against the window, no longer in plea but in witness, her posture saying, "You all see this now." Derek Lawson, still cuffed, still bent under the force of another man's hand, did not lunge for the pin. He did not shout his identity. He did not cry out for recognition. He simply lifted his chin, a small, quiet movement that rearranged the entire air around him. He looked Halpern in the eye, and then he turned his gaze to Briggs. Not with hatred, not with plea, but with a calm clarity that said without words, "You know what this is. And so does everyone else." It worked like a mirror. For a moment, Briggs seemed to see herself reflected in his gaze, and she did not like what stared back. Her jaw tightened, her hands slid into her coat pockets, the closest thing she could manage to stepping away from the cliff without falling. The chant swelled louder. "Governor? Governor!" The word became a roar, a single syllable carrying the power of truth. Phones pinged with notifications as live streams multiplied. On one screen, a local news account cut to a split feed. On one side, the street with Lawson cuffed under flashing lights. On the other, a press photo of him at a podium. The same jawline, the same gray temples, the same small gold pin on his lapel. The caption wrote itself. "Breaking. Governor Derek Lawson detained." Halpern tried again to regain control, but his voice had lost its iron edge. "Everyone back up." "Phone's down," he barked, but the command landed like a joke. A delivery driver shouted back, "We're not blind." The silver-haired woman who had stood tall earlier planted her feet and said clear as a bell, "We know who he is." The crowd answered with a fresh wave of "Governor! Governor!" that rattled the street. Monica's breathing steadied, her eyes sharpened, and she reached for her children, no longer only shielding them but showing them the moment. They looked through the window at their father, their sobs quieting into hiccups, their wide eyes absorbing the sight of the man who, even in chains, stood taller than the night meant him to, and Derek did nothing to seize the narrative. He stayed with the silence he had carried all night, letting the truth assemble itself. He did not declare himself governor. He remained what he had said earlier, a father. He angled his body so his children could see his face and not the back of his head, holding their gaze with an expression of calm determination. Everything else, the chants, the lights, the rank, the panic, spun around the stillness of that look. The pin on the pavement had done what no argument, no denial, no intimidation could undo. It revealed who he was, and no force could push that revelation back into darkness. Lieutenant Briggs finally broke her silence. Her voice was low, careful, but the weight of it carried. "Control the scene," she said. 3 words designed not to release him, not to restore dignity, but to contain the optics. The crowd heard it instantly for what it was, a choice to protect the institution, not the truth. The chant thundered louder, angrier, more insistent. "Governor? Governor!" A boy with a bike looked up from his screen and shouted, "We're live to 20,000. Within seconds, the number doubled, then tripled. A woman further back called her sister, holding the phone aloft. "It's him," she said, her voice trembling. "They've got the governor in cuffs right here." And still, Derek Lawson remained silent. He let the truth build without his hand on it, because the truth rolling downhill gathers more power without being pushed. He stood steady, wrists burning, shoulders aching, eyes unwavering, his silence becoming a verdict the night itself had to bear. The street had transformed from a scene into a statement. Halpern, once the largest presence in the block, looked suddenly small, caught on the wrong side of a line he had not seen until it was too late. Briggs's calculation could not mask the fact that history was now watching, and the crowd, swelling in voice and numbers, refused to let the moment slip back into shadows. The chant filled the air, drowning out the sirens, bouncing between houses and storefronts, louder with each repetition. The governor's pin still glowed on the asphalt, a tiny emblem now carrying the weight of an entire state. Strangers lifted their phones higher. Reporters miles away queued up breaking alerts. Porch lights turned brighter as if the neighborhood itself was leaning in to bear witness, and in the middle of it all stood Derek Lawson, bound but unbroken, a father and a leader, his silence saying more than any declaration could. What had been humiliation a moment before had become revelation. What had been a single arrest on a suburban street was now a reckoning, and as the chant rolled on, "Governor, Governor," the night shifted. The balance of power had cracked. The truth was loose in the air, indelible, undeniable, unstoppable. By the time dawn broke, The street where Derek Lawson had been cuffed and humiliated was no longer just a neighborhood in Atlanta. It had become a symbol. The video shot by George Miller, a gray-bearded veteran with a steady hand, was uploaded before the first hint of sunrise. At first it was just another clip on a crowded internet, but within minutes it began to spread like a tide breaking against every digital shore. By the time most people poured their first cup of coffee, millions had seen it. The counter spun so fast it looked like a slot machine. Local newscasts that had prepared for the usual cycle of traffic reports and weather alerts instead led with those flashing red and blue lights, that gold pin gleaming on asphalt, and a governor forced to his knees under the hand of a man sworn to uphold the law. On screen, anchors replayed the moment again and again, the ping of the pin hitting the hood, the crowd's chant of "Governor," swelling until it swallowed the night. Commentators tried to keep their voices steady as they narrated the footage, but the tremor in their words betrayed the gravity of what they were showing. This wasn't just a traffic stop gone wrong. This was a collapse of the line between authority and abuse, broadcast to every living room in America. National outlets quickly took over. Satellite trucks crowded the cul-de-sac before the first commuters had even left for work. Helicopters circled overhead, their cameras capturing aerial shots of what had become overnight a living newsroom. The street that hours before had been home to porch lights and sleepy driveways was now a stage for the nation. But the most powerful voice wasn't the anchors or the commentators. It was Monica Lawson. By mid-morning, she had become the quiet heart of the storm. Sitting with her children on a neighbor's porch, still wearing the soft sweater she had on the night before, she spoke to the cameras with eyes rimmed red but steady. Her voice wavered, but the words cut clean. No family should face this terror for simply driving home. It wasn't delivered like a speech. It wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was a mother's plea, but it moved like wildfire. Within an hour, that single sentence was everywhere, captioned under videos, subtitled on clips, scrawled across headlines. People shared it like scripture. In church group chats, in veterans forums, in neighborhood text chains, the line was repeated until it was no longer just her voice. It was everyone's. The hashtag #JusticeForLawson appeared within minutes and shot upward like a rocket. By late morning, it had eclipsed sports finals and celebrity scandals, trending at the very top of national lists. The words flashed across Twitter feeds, TikTok overlays, Facebook live streams. Strangers who had never heard Derek Lawson's name suddenly found themselves quoting his wife. No family should face this terror. It was painted onto cardboard signs within hours. It rolled off tongues at rallies organized in real time. By noon, people were gathering in city squares hundreds of miles away, chanting the governor's name as if he belonged to all of them. In New York, crowds filled the steps of the public library, holding handmade posters that read, "Justice for Lawson" and "Protect our families." In Chicago, marchers carried banners through downtown streets, their voices echoing between glass towers. In California, commuters stopped on freeway overpasses to hang sheets with Derek's name scrawled in block letters. Someone in Los Angeles projected "Justice for Lawson" onto the side of a high-rise, so large it could be seen from airplanes descending into LAX. What surprised me most wasn't the size of the protests, but the makeup. It wasn't only the governor's supporters or his political allies. Veterans in ball caps, church elders in Sunday clothes, parents pushing strollers, young people with backpacks and phones raised high. They all joined in. Even those who had never voted for him stood shoulder to shoulder, saying that politics didn't matter here. A man driving his family home should not be dragged into terror. That was universal. Back on the Atlanta street, the quiet suburb had transformed into a press hub. Reporters lined the sidewalks, their microphones crowding for space in front of cameras. Words like constitutional rights, systemic reform, and civil rights investigation began threading through their reports. Federal officials weighed in quickly. The Department of Justice announced a rapid inquiry. A senior White House official issued a statement calling the detention potentially unlawful. Each hour brought another statement, each one sharper than the last. By midday, it was clear that this wasn't going to fade into the usual cycle of outrage and forgetfulness. The story had grown too large, too fast, and too personal for too many people. Through it all, Derek Lawson himself remained mostly silent. Released before dawn, he stayed with his family at a private residence, issuing only a brief written note. In it, he thanked neighbors for their courage, urged calm and asked for peaceful responses. That silence didn't weaken the moment. It made it stronger. People leaned in, waiting for his first public words, treating his quiet as if it carried the weight of something sacred. The absence of his voice only amplified Monica's, turning her plea into the beating heart of the movement. By early afternoon, the ripple had become a wave. Marches swelled in half a dozen cities. People sang hymns, chanted slogans, carried candles even under the midday sun. Police scanners reported peaceful protests stretching from Boston to Dallas. And everywhere the same phrase appeared, handwritten on signs, painted on banners, projected on walls. No family should face this terror. What had begun as one woman's cry in the chaos of flashing lights had become a vow for the nation. The energy was unlike anything I had ever seen. It wasn't the explosion of rage that so often follows injustice. It was steadier, deeper, like a current moving beneath the surface of daily life, pulling everyone toward the same undeniable truth. Parents squeezed their children tighter. Veterans shared stories of their own traffic stops. Elders spoke of decades of seeing the same patterns play out. Each post, each video, each chant became part of a larger chorus, a collective insistence that what had happened on that Atlanta street mattered to everyone. In Washington, pressure mounted by the hour. Lawmakers who usually avoided the cameras rushed to microphones. Some spoke of civil rights. Others spoke of law enforcement accountability. The Attorney General's office promised federal oversight. The mayor of Atlanta called for calm, but acknowledged the gravity of what had unfolded. For once, the political lines blurred. What had happened was too stark, too visible to be spun away. The sight of a governor in cuffs, his children crying in the back seat, the glint of a gold pin on pavement, it was burned into the public's imagination. By dusk, the courthouse square in Atlanta had transformed into something close to sacred ground. Thousands gathered with candles, their faces lit in soft gold. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, humming hymns and chanting in unison. "Justice belongs to everyone," they sang, the words carrying through the warm night air like a river of sound. I stood among them watching as the gold pin, now polished and placed in a small glass case at the base of the courthouse steps, gleamed under candlelight. It looked less like metal and more like sunrise, a symbol not of one man but of the question now burning in everyone's mind. What will we do to protect justice? And that night, as chants echoed and candles burned low, it was clear that what had begun as a single family's nightmare had become something larger than any office or any man. It had become a movement, unstoppable and still gathering strength. By the time the sun dipped behind the Atlanta skyline, the city felt like it was holding its breath. The governor's silence, Monica's words, and the viral videos had already shaken the ground, but what came next would tear open the very walls that were built to contain the truth. At police headquarters, the mood was taut, brittle, as if the building itself understood that history was knocking on its doors. Inside, an emergency meeting had been called. All ranks were ordered to attend. Phones left outside, the kind of gathering that promised reckoning. Officers filed into the room, their uniforms creased, their eyes darting. No one wanted to meet anyone else's gaze. It was the look of people who had rehearsed silence for years, suddenly realizing silence might no longer protect them. At the front stood a veteran lieutenant, a black man whose name the city knew from community barbecues and charity drives. He was close to retirement, his hair graying at the temples, his voice seasoned by decades on the job. When he spoke, it was without a microphone, but the weight of his words carried to the last row. "We swore to protect justice," he said, his tone measured, steady, but heavy as stone. "Not criminals with a badge." The line hit the room like a hammer. Chairs creaked, throats cleared nervously, but no one interrupted. He went on, speaking truths that had been whispered in corners for years. Reports had been polished smooth to hide bruises. Complaints had been buried under paperwork. Rage like Rick Halpern's was not a lightning strike, he said. It was a forecast, a storm everyone had seen building. His words pulled the quiet part out loud, placing it in the center of the room where no one could look away. When he finally sank into his chair, the silence that followed wasn't respect. It was reckoning. Not everyone agreed. A captain rose, his voice wrapped in policy, muttering phrases like rapidly evolving circumstances and officer safety protocols. He tried to cloak the moment in bureaucracy, to shield the room with language pulled from binders. But the spell didn't work anymore. The old words had lost their power. Outside the building, the sound of protest was already reaching the walls. Chants of no one above the law rolling down the block, seeping in through glass and stone. I stood on the front steps of headquarters as night settled in. The crowd had grown larger, candles glowing like small suns against the cold stone facade. People held signs in one hand and phones in the other. The chants rose, then dipped into silence, then rose again as if breathing together. Every time the lobby doors opened, the sound rushed inside like a tide, washing through corridors not built to hold it. And then, through the murmurs of the crowd, a rumor began to spread. Not shouted, not plastered on screens, but passed from one person to the next with the kind of care that made it believable. A young officer, people whispered, had seen enough and decided to act. He had sent files to a reporter he trusted. Not speculation, not gossip, but documentation, complaints, internal emails, even audio recordings. Minutes later, my phone buzzed and the rumor became truth. A local paper pushed a breaking alert. A national site followed. Then the clip arrived. It was only 30 seconds long, but it cut through the night like a blade. A woman's voice, low and precise, Lieutenant Laura Briggs. "Don't report every detail," she said. "Keep it clean. Not shouted, not sloppy. Surgical." The crowd listened to the recording in stunned silence. It wasn't news that the system protected itself, but it was another thing entirely to hear it. To hear the bolts turned, the silences engineered. A man standing next to me, the kind who might have called himself apolitical the day before, shook his head, his voice rough with disbelief. "She said it like she was ordering coffee," he muttered. Like it was normal. Inside the precinct, normal was cracking apart. Officers who had trained themselves to keep their heads down suddenly found themselves staring into a mirror they didn't control. Some looked furious, as if betrayed. Others looked terrified. A few even looked relieved, like secrets they had carried too long had finally been dragged into daylight. The veteran lieutenant asked for the floor again. "Enough," he said, softer now but somehow larger. The word filled the room like both a demand and a promise. In the back, a young officer stared at the exit instead of the front, his jaw tight. Maybe he was the whistleblower, maybe not, but the choice in his eyes was the same one facing everyone now: stay silent or step forward. Outside, the crowd swelled with the weight of the revelation. The chant changed shape. No one above the law became "charge them both." It wasn't a storm, it was a tide, slow, steady, unrelenting. Patrol officers posted on the steps exchanged glances, their faces betraying recognition. They heard the words and saw themselves in them. Then another alert hit phones, louder than any chant. A new clip, longer, harder to swallow. Body cam audio from a prior stop. Halpern's voice unmistakable. His tone was sharp, sneering, his words laced with cruelty. The audio was punctuated with silence where procedure should have been, replaced by the sound of someone's muffled whimper. It ran like a reel of accusations long denied but now undeniable. The crowd didn't cheer. They went still. Truth can do that. It doesn't always ignite celebration. Sometimes it makes a crowd quiet, because the thing you wanted to believe is also the thing that hurts to hold. Reporters pressed closer to the doors, microphones tilted toward the building, waiting for official response. The mayor's office promised cooperation. The police union pushed back, mumbling about due process. But the gravity had already settled. This wasn't about one officer anymore. It wasn't even about one night. It was a vein that ran back into the heart of the institution itself, and the heart needed surgery. The meeting inside headquarters ended without resolution. I heard later that some officers walked straight to internal affairs, making statements they should have made years ago. Others whispered about optics and timelines, still clinging to silence. Everybody chooses a side, whether they admit it or not. Outside, the vigil became a roar. Candles burned lower, wax dripping on stone, but the sound grew louder. A choir from a nearby church began a hymn, voices rising into the night until protest blurred with prayer. People held hands, some crying, some whispering words of faith, all of them waiting for the next turn in the story. And then it came. Another leak. This time a full transcript of an internal call. Briggs's voice again, cold and methodical. "No mention of force unless there's broken skin," she said. A pause. Then quieter. "We can't afford that headline this quarter." It wasn't just a cover-up. It was strategy, calculated, deliberate, The crowd listened, their faces lit by the glow of phones, their expressions caught between fury and exhaustion. A man beside me whispered, "She planned it." His voice was almost reverent, as if naming the truth out loud gave it more weight. The chants shifted again.
"Charge them both,"
filled the square, bouncing off glass and stone until it seemed the whole city was repeating it. Patrol officers on the steps kept their faces neutral, but their eyes betrayed them. Some blinked fast, some looked away. The tide was too strong. Another clip surfaced, this time from a shop security camera across the street from that first night. It captured the reflection in a window, a sliver of the patrol car's interior. In it, Halpern's hand hovered near his gun, and another officer's hand, faceless in the reflection, reached across, touching his arm, not forceful, but pleading. The gun stayed holstered, but the image was damning. The defense tried to spin it quickly, releasing statements about perspective, about distorted angles. But the prosecutor's office was already circling, reviewing footage frame by frame, matching policy lines to images until the truth was stitched tight. The leaks had done what years of rumors never could. They pinned names to actions, voices to cover-ups, reflections to intent. That night, the district attorney's office issued a statement, promising formal charges pending review of the leaked materials. A judge authorized emergency subpoenas. Both Halpern and Briggs were placed on immediate suspension. The crowd didn't cheer, not exactly. What they released was something deeper. A collective exhale, like a door had opened into a room they'd been told didn't exist. The recordings had made denial impossible. From that moment forward, there was no safe script left for either of them. The next chapter wouldn't be written in briefing rooms or through press releases. It would be written under oath in court with the nation watching. And standing in that crowd, candles flickering, chants echoing, phones buzzing with every new update, I felt the city shift. The weight of years of silence was cracking. The system had been forced into the light, and though the fight ahead would be long, for the first time it felt possible that truth might actually win. The courthouse felt too small for the weight of the day it was asked to hold. By dawn, the line to enter stretched down the block. Neighbors from that Atlanta street gripping folders, federal observers in dark suits moving with clipped precision, reporters hunched over laptops whispering into headsets. The murmur inside was electric, the kind of hum that happens when people know they are about to witness something that will be remembered. When the doors to hearing room 3 opened, a hush moved in ahead of us. Every bench filled within seconds. The air was heavy with the smell of paper and tension. At the front, the panel of judges took their seats, faces stern, pens poised. When the prosecutor rose, his posture was stripped of theatrics. No raised voice, no flourishes, just a deliberate presence that carried to the last row. "Today," he began, his tone low but unwavering, "we examine not just an assault but a system of abuse." The words landed like a gavel, rearranging the room's spine. At the defense table, Rick Halpern sat broad-shouldered in a plain gray suit, stripped of his badge, his bravado drained. He stared at a legal pad he never wrote on, his hands clenched white against the wood. 2 seats over, Lieutenant Laura Briggs held herself stiff. Her jaw locked, her hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. She didn't blink often. When she did, her eyes skated over the gallery without resting, as though to look anywhere else was safer. The prosecutor began with the street. He rolled footage from traffic cameras showing the patrol car shadowing the governor's SUV for blocks. No violation called, no probable cause cited. Then he layered in the doorbell camera from a nearby house, capturing the patrol car's lights filling the quiet street, the governor's SUV pulling calmly to the curb. He didn't narrate. He let the silence in the room fill with what the images showed. Then came the live stream videos, phones capturing the slap of the officer's palm on the hood, the wallet smacked to the ground, the fists, the cuffs. The room flinched with each replayed blow. The prosecutor returned only to mark timestamps, to set one fact beside another, to let the accumulation speak louder than outrage could. When it was the defense's turn, Halpern's attorney tried to drape the familiar cloth of justification. Instinct for safety, he said over and over like armor. He spoke of rapidly evolving circumstances, of split-second decisions, of threat assessments. He gestured toward Halpern with an open palm, as if presenting not a disgraced officer but a firefighter who had run into heat, not created it. The words hung in the air like smoke, but no one coughed them away. When the prosecutor rose again, he said simply, Let's test that. He cued body cam footage. It showed calm compliance, deliberate movements narrated by Lawson, each action careful, each word measured. No sudden lunges, no hidden hands. He read from the department's own use of force policy, line by line, until the language became a ruler held to a crooked seam. The more he read, the clearer the seam looked. Then came the audio leaks. The first clip filled the courtroom with Laura Briggs's voice, precise and cold. Don't report every detail. Keep it clean. Not shouted, not sloppy, surgical. The pause after the playback was longer than the clip itself. Faces on the panel stiffened. Pens scratched harder. Briggs's attorney tried to reframe it, spinning words about preventing public panic and politicized oversight. But the prosecutor pressed play again. A longer recording. Briggs's voice calm as winter. No mention of force unless there's broken skin. We can't afford that headline this quarter. The sentence landed like a ceiling cracking above us. Briggs didn't collapse. She diminished. Her shoulders sank a fraction. Her eyes fixed on the table where no one could look back. The witnesses followed. The silver-haired woman who had shouted from the curb took the stand, her voice trembling but clear. She described watching Halpern's fist land, hearing Monica scream, hearing the children cry. The delivery driver testified next, his polo stained from work. His phone raised as he told the court, I shouted because I couldn't let him think no one was watching. The teenager with the bike came after, a borrowed dress shirt too big on his frame, his voice cracking but resolute as he described zooming in on the pin. Each story was a sliver and the slivers matched. When it was George Miller's turn, the veteran carried the room like a choir carries a hymn. He explained how he had tracked the reflection from the shop window, how he had secured the footage, how he had once been a soldier and knew the difference between fear and fury. He wasn't scared, Miller said of Halpern. He was sure he could get away with it. No one applauded. No one needed to. The defense tried one last tactic. Briggs's attorney leaned into politics, suggesting she was acting under pressure from above, that the city was on edge, that her decisions were measured to preserve order. It almost sounded plausible, until the prosecutor played the recording again, her voice talking about broken skin and headlines. The sound filled the room like an indictment etched in ice. Halpern's lawyer clutched crime statistics, training schedules, maps dotted with incidents. But it all felt irrelevant. Weather reports after the roof had already caved in. The panel's pens moved steadily, their faces carved in stone. Near the end, the prosecutor glanced to the first row where Derek Lawson sat with Monica and their children. He didn't call the governor as a witness, no political theater. Instead, he looked back at the panel and said, "Consider the simplest measure of all, what we have all seen and heard." He closed with the same line he had opened, softened by the hours but heavier now. "Not just an assault," he said. "A system." Before recess, something happened that wasn't on any schedule. Derek Lawson rose. He didn't approach the stand. He didn't address the defense. He simply turned to the room, to the men and women who had abandoned morning routines to be there, and spoke. His voice was low but carried. "Justice is not a gift," he said. "It is a right." No flourish, no applause line. Yet the response was instant. Hands clapped, throats caught, a few sobs escaped, grief and relief interwoven. The judge let it run for a breath before striking the gavel. The sound brought us back, but something in the room had shifted. We had come to see a case. We realized we were witnessing a reckoning. When the final day came, the courtroom was packed tighter than ever. Journalists with badges clipped high, neighbors from the block clutching coffee cups, federal observers seated stiff. The hum was constant until the clerk's voice cut it clean. "Court is now in session. This is the matter of the state versus Officer Rick Halpern and Lieutenant Laura Briggs." At the defense table, Halpern sat like a man finally aware of gravity, his uniform replaced by a plain suit that couldn't hide his bulk, but revealed his fragility. His bravado was gone, replaced by hollow stillness. Briggs held herself rigid, hair pulled tight, eyes skating once more over the gallery without landing. The prosecutor's closing was simple thunder. "This verdict is not merely about one night," he said. "It is about whether those sworn to uphold the law believe they stand above it." He walked through the evidence once more. The videos, the audio, the reflection in the shop window, the voices of witnesses, the policies broken line by line. Each piece of proof settled like a stone on a scale already heavy with guilt. The defense had little left to offer. Halpern's lawyer clung to phrases about fatigue and instinct, but his words sagged under their own weight. Briggs's attorney muttered about politics, about oversight, but the leaked recording shadowed every syllable. When the judge finally lifted her gavel, her voice was steady but iron beneath. This court finds Officer Rick Halpern guilty of aggravated assault under color of authority and of falsifying official reports. He is hereby stripped of his badge and rank and sentenced to a long-term prison term with no possibility of parole. The phrase echoed like iron locking in place. She turned to the next table. Lieutenant Laura Briggs is found guilty of conspiracy to obstruct justice and of willful misconduct in public office. She is hereby dismissed from the Atlanta Police Department, stripped of pension rights, and referred for federal prosecution. The room exhaled, a sound caught between relief and disbelief. Some clapped once before catching themselves. Then stillness returned, deeper than before. From the front row came movement. Monica stood, her hands trembling, folding Derek into an embrace that seemed to anchor the entire room. Their children rushed forward, the boy bearing his face in his father's jacket, the girl pressing her cheek against his chest. Derek bent to them, his arms free now, his wrists unchained, his body no longer forced down but upright. Whole. They stayed that way, a small island of quiet in the storm, long enough for reporters to lower their cameras and give the family space. Some wiped their own eyes. I realized I was doing the same. Outside, the sound was already waiting. As the courthouse doors swung open, the chant of thousands rolled in like a wave. Justice has been served. Justice has been served. The voices rattled flagpoles, shook window panes, carried through the city. Candles were raised high, banners unfurled. Strangers hugged as if they had known each other all their lives. Television crews captured every angle. Live feeds streamed to millions, but no camera could quite contain the raw relief in the air. Derek Lawson paused on the top step, Monica's hand in his children's fingers wrapped around his own. For a moment he simply looked out, at the packed square, at the cameras, at the sky turning gold in late afternoon. He didn't make a speech. He didn't need to. The verdict had already spoken louder than any words. Behind him, the courthouse doors closed with a heavy thud, like punctuation at the end of a chapter the nation had been forced to read. The case that had begun as a traffic stop in a quiet suburb ended as a landmark in the fight for justice. A reminder etched into every witness, every recording, every chant, no badge, no rank. No system is stronger than truth when people are brave enough to carry it into the light. By the next morning, the trial was no longer just a verdict. It had already transformed into a movement. Everywhere I looked, screens glowed with the same image: Governor Derek Lawson kneeling to embrace his children in the courthouse aisle, their small arms wrapped tight around his neck while Monica stood behind them, her face lined with exhaustion but steadied by relief. The photograph traveled faster than any headline, faster than any speech. It became an emblem, passed from one feed to another, printed in newspapers, broadcast across networks, shared in text threads among strangers who suddenly felt connected by the same story. The picture spoke in a language no one could twist: a father freed, a family intact, and a nation forced to look at itself. On social media, the hashtag #JusticeForLawson surged again, but now it carried a new weight. It wasn't only anger anymore. It was remembrance, solidarity, a rallying point for people to share their own stories of injustice. Veterans posted about traffic stops that had left them humiliated. Parents wrote of the fear they carried every time their children left home. Church leaders spoke of prayer meetings turned into planning sessions for marches. The hashtag wasn't just a trend, it was a rising tide, a digital backbone for something happening in the streets. By dusk, the courthouse square had transformed into something sacred. Every step, every stone ledge was covered in candles, their flames glowing like constellations against the heavy night. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, humming hymns and chants, some holding hands, others clutching signs, all bound together by the memory of what had unfolded inside. A choir from a nearby church began to sing, and soon thousands of voices joined them in unison. Justice belongs to everyone. The words rolled through the square, steady and unstoppable, like a river carving through stone. Even those who couldn't carry the tune hummed along, letting the sound stitch them into the fabric of the night. It wasn't protest anymore. It was something deeper, Memory forming in real time, a collective vow that what had happened here would not be forgotten. People cried, people prayed, people stood in silence. And then Derek Lawson appeared again, stepping out onto the courthouse steps beneath the towering pillars, wearing the same dark suit from trial, but carrying himself with the posture of a man who had been tested and tempered. The crowd hushed instantly, as if the air itself knew it had to hold still. He didn't rush. He let the quiet settle before he spoke. "I'm angry," he began. The words startled in their simplicity. The crowd leaned closer, but angry to make change, not to seek revenge. The honesty of it landed heavier than any speech could. His voice gathered strength as he continued. "Tonight I accept the responsibility to lead a federal task force on police reform. We will look hard at training, oversight, and the culture that allowed this to happen. We will not waste this pain." The cheer that followed was less an eruption than a rolling affirmation, deep and resonant, like the sound of something heavy being lifted together. Behind him, Monica stepped forward, her children drowsy but insistent on staying by their parents' side. She placed a gentle hand on Derek's shoulder, facing the lights and cameras with quiet courage. Her voice was soft, but every word carried through the crowd. No mother should watch her children cry like that because of injustice. For a moment, the square froze in reverent silence. Then applause broke out. Not the shallow clapping of ceremony, but the kind that comes when truth has settled deep in the bones of everyone present. As the night stretched on, candles continued to burn. Some people prayed aloud. Others simply stood, letting the music, the silence, and the memory do the work. At the base of the courthouse steps, inside a small glass case, rested the gold governor's pin that had once clattered onto the asphalt. Polished clean, it gleamed in the candlelight like a tiny sunrise. People gathered around it, taking pictures, some weeping quietly, others bowing their heads as if in front of a relic. It had become more than metal. It was a reminder of what had been risked, what had been revealed, and what had been won. Walking away past midnight, I found myself glancing back at that pin. In the low light, it didn't look like gold anymore. It looked like a question turned into light, aimed at every person who had seen the story unfold. What will you do to protect justice? That question, more than the chance, more than the verdict, lingered in the air. Because the story of Derek Lawson had ceased to be about one man or one family, it had become a living reminder that justice is not a favor granted, but a right that must be chosen, guarded, and renewed by all of us, every day. In the weeks that followed, the movement only grew. Vigils turned into marches. Marches turned into organized campaigns. People carried Monica's words on signs, on banners, and songs. No family should face this terror became a vow across cities. Schools discussed it in classrooms. Churches echoed it in sermons. Even places far from Atlanta claimed it as their own. In Los Angeles, a mural appeared overnight showing Derek with his children, the gold pin glowing like a beacon at his chest. In New York, a flash march filled Times Square, the words projected onto billboards usually reserved for brands and Broadway shows. In small towns, people gathered in community halls, holding up candles and repeating Monica's plea as if it were their own. The federal task force Derek promised quickly became reality. Officials from across the country met under his leadership. Policies long discussed but never enacted were suddenly on the table. Independent review boards, body cam mandates with no exceptions, real consequences for falsified reports. The culture of silence that had protected men like Halpern and Briggs was being pried open, inch by inch. It was messy, it was slow, but it was happening. And every time progress threatened to stall, the image of that pin, of that courthouse embrace, pulled the conversation back on track. Not everyone welcomed it. Some clung to old defenses, muttering about political theater and media storms. But their voices grew smaller against the tide of people who had seen the videos, heard the recordings, and felt the chants in their own throats. The truth was out, and it wasn't going back into silence. Derek himself remained measured, not triumphal. He gave few speeches, choosing instead to focus on policy, meetings, reforms. Monica's voice, too, continued to echo. She spoke at schools and community centers, always reminding her audiences of one thing: the children. They saw their father in handcuffs for no reason, she said. We cannot let them believe that is normal. Months later, when the pin was placed permanently in the State Museum, displayed behind glass with a plaque explaining its story, people lined up to see it. Parents brought children, pointing to it not as an artifact of politics but as a lesson of courage. Teachers assigned essays about what it symbolized. Veterans saluted it quietly. It became, in its smallness, a monument to a turning point. And though Derek Lawson continued his work, though Monica carried her quiet strength, though their children began to heal from the memory of that night, the pin stayed behind as a reminder for the rest of us. Not of power, but of responsibility. Not of one man's title, but of the truth that no badge, no rank, no system is greater than the people's demand for justice. Every time I think back on those nights, the flashing lights, the chants, the hymns, the hush that fell when the truth was spoken, I return to that image of the pin glowing in the dark. It asks the same question still. What will you do to protect justice? And the answer, I think, is not in speeches or verdicts alone, but in the daily choices we make to stand together, to refuse silence, to hold power accountable. That is the legacy of Derek Lawson's story. That is the light that PIN now carries for all of us.